For over 2,000 years, political philosophers asked, what is the ideal state? Plato described a perfect republic ruled by philosopher-kings. Aristotle catalogued 6 forms of government and their virtues. Medieval thinkers tried to reconcile divine authority with earthly power. Then Machiavelli walked in and said, "Forget the ideal. Let's talk about what actually works." This is where the revolution begins. Welcome back. Last time we established why we're studying Saylor's model of Machiavellian political economy, because it gives us a systems-based understanding of how power and economics interact, rather than an ideological one. But to understand what made Machiavelli revolutionary and why Saylor chose him as the foundation for an economic model, we need to understand what came before. Today we're covering the key political philosophers from Plato through the Middle Ages. We'll see what questions they were asking, what assumptions they made, what Machiavelli rejected, and what Machiavelli kept. Think of this as establishing the coordinate system. You need to know where the origin is before you can understand the transformation. Let's start in Athens, 380 BCE. Plato's Republic is probably the most influential work of political philosophy ever written. It asks, what is justice, and what would a just society look like? Plato's answer is radical. A just society requires a strict hierarchy based on natural abilities. At the top, philosopher-kings. These are people who understand truth and goodness. They rule not for power or wealth, but because they're the only ones capable of governing justly. In the middle, guardians or auxiliaries. These are warriors and administrators. They're brave and disciplined, but they take orders from the philosophers. At the bottom, producers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants. They're driven by appetites. They want food, comfort, wealth. They lack the reasoning capacity to govern. Each class has a virtue: wisdom for the rulers, courage for the guardians, moderation for the producers. When everyone stays in their lane and performs their function, you have justice. Now, there are some problems here that Machiavelli will later exploit. First, this is entirely normative. Plato describes how things ought to be, not how they are. He never seriously asks whether this system is achievable or sustainable. Second, it assumes that philosopher-kings will be selfless, that power won't corrupt them, that they'll genuinely pursue the good rather than their own interests. Third, it's static. There's no theory of change, no feedback loops, no dynamics. The Republic either exists perfectly or it doesn't. Fourth, it ignores class conflict. Plato just assumes each class will accept their role. But what happens when the producers want political power? When the guardians decide they'd rather rule? Keep these problems in mind. Machiavelli is going to flip every single one. Aristotle, Plato's student, takes a more empirical approach. Instead of describing the ideal state, he studies actual constitutions from over 150 Greek city-states. He creates a taxonomy: rule by one, few, or many. Each can be good or corrupt. Monarchy, rule by one for the common good versus tyranny, rule by one for self-interest. Aristocracy, rule by few for the common good versus oligarchy, rule by few for self-interest. Polity, rule by many for the common good versus democracy, rule by many for self-interest. Notice, Aristotle distinguishes who rules from how well they rule. His key insight is that different constitutions suit different circumstances. There's no single ideal form. It depends on the population's character, wealth distribution, cultural values. Aristotle also observes that constitutions change over time. Monarchy becomes tyranny when the king prioritizes himself. Tyranny collapses into aristocracy when the nobles rebel. Aristocracy becomes oligarchy through corruption, and so on. This is closer to what Machiavelli will do. Aristotle sees actual behavior, not just ideals. dynamics and change over time, the role of self-interest, different equilibria for different conditions. But Aristotle still thinks in terms of virtue and justice. He's still asking what's the right form of government, just in a more sophisticated way. Machiavelli will ask, what form of government actually survives? What makes states strong or weak? Forget right. What works? Now we jump forward to Polybius, a Greek historian living in Rome around 150 BCE. Polybius is important because he describes political change as a cycle, and this directly influences Machiavelli. Polybius's cycle goes like this. Monarchy emerges from chaos. One strong leader establishes order. Monarchy becomes tyranny as the king's descendants grow corrupt and self-interested. Aristocracy forms when nobles overthrow the tyrant. They rule for the common good for a while. Aristocracy becomes oligarchy as aristocrats pursue their own interests instead of the public good. Democracy emerges when the people overthrow the oligarchs. Initially, it's for common welfare. Democracy becomes mob rule as demagogues manipulate the masses and chaos returns. Back to monarchy to restore order. The cycle repeats. This is called Anacyclosis, the cycle of constitutions. Why does Polybius matter? First, he sees political systems as dynamic, not static. They inevitably change, may? Second, he identifies the mechanism, corruption. Good forms degenerate into bad forms through self-interest overtaking public interest. Third, he observes that the Roman Republic of his time had found a way to slow the cycle through mixed government. Rome combined monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. Each checked the others. Fourth, even with mixed government, Polybius knows the cycle will eventually continue. You can slow decay, but not prevent it forever. Machiavelli reads Polybius closely. He'll take the idea of cyclical change and the insight about mixed government, but he'll build something more rigorous, something we can actually model mathematically. Between Polybius and Machiavelli, we have about 1,500 years of political thought dominated by a different question. How do we reconcile divine authority with earthly power? Theologians like Augustine and Aquinas argue that all authority ultimately comes from God. Earthly rulers are legitimate only if they serve divine purposes. The purpose of the state is to help people achieve salvation. Justice means conforming to natural law and divine will. This is sophisticated philosophy, but for our purposes, it doubles down on the problems we saw in Plato. It's normative. How should rulers behave according to Christian ethics? It assumes rulers can and should be virtuous in a specific moral sense. It's not interested in dynamics or feedback loops. It doesn't grapple with what happens when rulers are not virtuous. There's also a practical problem. Who decides what counts as divine will? The Pope? The Emperor? Local princes? Medieval Europe is racked by conflicts between secular and religious authority. This isn't just philosophy. It's about who actually has power. By Machiavelli's time, early 1500s Italy, this whole framework is collapsing. Italy is fragmented into competing city-states. Popes and princes are openly corrupt. Foreign armies invade repeatedly. Alliances shift constantly. The gap between how rulers should behave and how rulers actually behave has never been wider. Into this chaos walks Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli's innovation is to completely abandon the normative approach. He doesn't ask, what is the ideal ruler? He asks, what do successful rulers actually do? He doesn't ask, how should states be organized? He asks, what keeps states strong? What makes them collapse? He explicitly rejects the tradition we've been discussing. From The Prince, Chapter 15. Many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist, for there is such a gap between how one lives and how one ought to live that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. This is a direct attack on Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, everyone who tried to describe ideal states. Machiavelli says, the ideal doesn't matter. What matters is what actually works in the messy, brutal reality of politics. Here's what Machiavelli observes. People are primarily self-interested. Yes, they can be virtuous, but don't count on it. Design systems assuming self-interest. Power concentrates naturally. Unless actively prevented, power flows toward those who already have it. Circumstances matter immensely. What works in one situation fails in another. Successful rulers adapt to fortune, circumstance, contingency. Virtue is about effectiveness, not morality. A virtuous ruler is one who achieves their goals and strengthens the state, regardless of whether they're kind, honest, or pious. Republics are more stable than principalities, but only when properly designed. Mixed government helps, but you need more than that. Class conflict is inevitable. Rich and poor have opposed interests. You can manage this, but not eliminate it. Appearances matter. It's better to appear virtuous than to be virtuous if being virtuous makes you weak. Let's contrast the approaches. Traditional, normative, what ought to be. Machiavellian, descriptive, what is. Traditional, assume virtue in rulers. Machiavellian, assume self-interest. Traditional, static ideal forms. Machiavellian, dynamic, changing systems. Traditional, universal principles. Machiavellian, context-dependent strategies. Traditional, morality guides politics. Machiavellian, effectiveness is the only measure. Now, here's why this matters for Saylor's model. Machiavelli's approach has a problem. It's qualitative. He describes patterns, tells stories, gives advice. But you can't really test his claims rigorously. You can't run experiments. This is where Saylor comes in. Saylor realizes that Machiavelli's observations can be formalized as a system with state variables, wealth distribution, social norms, executive power, legislative power, production capacity. Feedback loops, how these variables affect each other. Parameters, things that characterize specific cases. How self-interested are people? How strong are social norms? How productive is the economy? Dynamics, how the system evolves over time. Once you have this formalization, you can simulate different scenarios, find equilibrium points, identify what makes systems stable or unstable, test whether Machiavelli's qualitative insights hold up quantitatively. This is the bridge from Renaissance political philosophy to modern systems dynamics. In the next video, we'll meet the first system theorists, the people who developed the mathematical tools that Saylor uses to model Machiavelli. But before that, I want you to think about the philosophers we covered today in terms of systems thinking. Here's your challenge. Take one of Polybius's constitutional transitions, say, democracy degenerating into mob rule, and think about it as a system. What are the feedback loops? As democratic power increases, what happens to demagoguery, to respect for law, to political stability, to economic policy? How might those effects feed back into democracy itself? Try sketching this out as a simple diagram. We haven't learned formal system dynamics notation yet, but use arrows to show cause and effect. See if you can identify positive, reinforcing, and negative, balancing feedback loops. Post your diagrams in the comments or tag me on social media. I'll feature the best ones in a future video. Next time, we'll dive into system dynamics itself. What is a stock? What is a flow? What makes feedback positive or negative? How do we go from qualitative observations to quantitative models? We're building the toolkit we'll need to understand Saylor's model. If you're enjoying this series, check out the full interactive course at the link in the description. And if you want to support more educational content like this, Consider the Bitcoin Lightning address or Patreon link below. See you in the next video.